South Africa had left the room. I'm not going to listen to this. With that testimony, the UN did something that was, again, unprecedented. It asked the International Court of Justice for an opinion on what is the actual status of Southwest Africa. The International Court of Justice came back and said, you know, you cannot force South Africa to put it under the trusteeship system. But, although the League of Nations is no longer, this is still a mandate. And as a mandate, South Africa has all of the responsibilities as an administering power to report to the only international body that is available to undertake this information, and that's the UN. You cannot say that because the League of Nations is gone, the mandate is gone, because if the mandate is gone, then you, South Africa, have no right to be on top of this land. It's that simple. South Africa went, no, it's not. And decided, and the US by this time is going, would you just send in a doggone report? Because what the US is seeing is that all of this is creating incredible churn in the UN. And it's creating these alignments because the Soviets are having a field day with this, right? And then just send in the report. South Africa said, I'll tell you what, we will send in the report, but only to you, Britain, and France. Even the US could smell that trap and said, no, no, you send it in to the Fourth Committee. They're the ones who get this report, not us. Well, this was the beginning of a showdown. And that showdown was fueled by the fact that because of Jim Crow in the United States needed to find what they said, a few outstanding Negroes to put on its international delegation to try to mitigate all of the lynching and Jim Crow stuff that's happening in the US. And one of those outstanding Negroes was a man named Channing Tobias, who was on the board of directors of the NAACP. Channing Tobias, you know, he had told his State Department handlers, I'm a team player, and I'm gonna play the team game. And the State Department was like, yeah. And then he said, but there are some things that stir my conscience, and that where I have really strong values, and I'm going to follow my conscience. And they went, okay. And so he's playing the team game all along, and boom, the Fourth Committee, because he's chairing the US delegation in the Fourth Committee. The Fourth Committee decides to really break with precedent this time. They're not going to ask the Reverend Michael Scott to come talk. They're going to ask the leaders of the Hereros, Namas, and Bergdamras to give direct testimony before the Fourth Committee of the UN on the conditions in Southwest Africa. If South Africa is not going to provide that information, we're going to let the people talk to us directly. Again, unprecedented. The British and the South Africans go ballistic. They're like, this is unprecedented. You are going to get hung on the gallows that you are building for us. You cannot do this. You are messing with our national sovereignty. This is intolerable. And the British prior to, the British and the Americans had worked out a little deal. You know, they had worked out what this dance would look like in the UN. And so the British would say, oh, this is intolerable. And then, and hand it off to the US. Well, the British do their intolerable dance, and they do the bump. And there's Channing Tobias. And he's sitting there with Benjamin Garrick, and Francis Sayre in the US delegation. And so Benjamin Garrick, who had been working with the British, gets ready to get up and tell the tale for the Brits. And Channing Tobias is a preacher. And he went, sit down. and Garrick would, and he said, but Garrick is still getting up because obviously he doesn't know what a black preacher really means when he says, sit down. And so he said, sit down. And the British are looking, well, wait a minute, because the cavalry's not coming. And so then Francis Sayre gets ready to get up, and Channing's going, son, sit down. But sit down. You ever had your mother talk to you that sit down? And they sat. And then when the other delegations realized that the Americans were not coming to the rescue, they ate South Africans and British up. By the time the vote was 37-7 with 7 abstentions to invite the Hereros, Namas, and Bergdamaras to give direct testimony before the UN. The NAACP wrote the check to pay for the transportation for them to come to the UN to give testimony. The British are apoplectic. First, the British delegation to the UN writes to the Foreign Office, you will not believe what the Americans just did. This is unacceptable, intolerable. I mean, this is where they have their freewheeling, amateurs. It's like amateur, this is unacceptable. We're going to have our foreign secretary talk to their secretary of state. And he went to the State Department. Let me tell you what Channing Tobias did. The State Department's sitting there going, ooh. Well, I guess this is what he meant. He said, there are some issues. They said, oh, that's really, okay. Channing Tobias is sitting there going, yes. South Africa says, over my dead body, and refuses to allow the Herero, Nama, Bergdamara leadership to leave the country. Refuses. Channing Tobias looks around, and as he tells Walter White, the head of the NAACP, I witnessed the brush off as the colonial powers were rejoicing that this got stopped this way. So they invited the Reverend Michael Scott to come back up and talk. And he said his was not the voice that the UN needed to hear. It was the voice of the people who had been battered and oppressed by white supremacy that the UN needed to hear from directly. But in that key critical moment, what the UN did was to in fact begin to set up a series of committees that not only investigated Southwest Africa, what would become Namibia, but also apartheid itself, to in fact move into national sovereignty, looking at the ways that a nation is organized domestically, because what it's doing domestically cannot be contained within those boundaries. This was the beginning of turning South Africa from a valued ally of the West to, as the CIA basically said, a political ball and chain. And the NAACP was knee-deep in this struggle, providing the infrastructure of resistance, which also included, like, I talked about the being bounded up in this little area. Walter White, the head of the NAACP, has said, we can't keep this man silent. This is wrong what the US is doing. Walter White's apartment happened to be in Midtown. So Walter White began to hold a series of cocktail parties and teas that became fundraisers that included journalists, senators, mayors, labor leaders, the opinion makers that began to reshape the norms about how issues are framed in the larger society. This is the NAACP. It's not spectacular, it's just effective. Now, how is this moment understood? The scholars basically say, I want to make sure I'm quoting them correctly, that the NAACP had cut a, quote, Faustian bargain, unquote, with the American administration to receive a pittance of civil rights concessions at home in exchange, quote, for silence on foreign policy issues and acquiescence in American and West European control of the world's colored peoples, unquote. Yet what the association did, this was not silence. It was not abandonment. It was another way of fighting. And this is another rich story, a rich, complicated story that we won't know until we write the African American Center back into the history of liberation. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
I'm interested in something I know nothing about, early American, but I know little whiffs of modern American political history. And first of all, I was thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt as FDR. FDR, and I assume that it would be Eleanor squared, FDR challenging Churchill on colonialism. We're not really going to let you have your empires after the war. And it was sort of an area of tension. And then we were talking about Tobias Channing being allowed to do what he did by the State Department quietly. I started thinking about Suez and Eisenhower basically undermining the French and the Brits in 1956. So I'm wondering how that kind of, should we say, official American decision to replace the British and French empires with their own empire, perhaps. Anyway, how did this play a role in this story?
In the early 40s, while World War II was still going on, the British and the French are absolutely convinced that the Americans are out to dismantle their empires and take over. The Americans weren't quite sure. Their sense was that colonialism, the way that the British and the French did it, it couldn't stand. It just, the pillars were already beginning to shake. And so there's incredible discussion and debate. In some of the initial planning papers for the State Department, they talk about coming out of this war, you have to have independence for the colonial peoples, which, you know, the British were, Sir Anthony Eden was just, this is unacceptable, I believe was the direct quote, unacceptable. What the Americans wanted was a different type of empire. And not one where you had just complete alien rule, but one that was more business oriented, one that was more linked in terms of a kind of patronage in a way. But a different type of empire, and they hadn't quite worked it out, and there were these incredible debates within the State Department and within the White House about what that looked like. When it came to South Africa, you had one wing of this, basically all wings of the State Department that I have read so far have said apartheid is odious. This thing is so backward. It's going against the tide of civilization. And then came the but. And so you had some who were saying this thing is utter nonsense. You had others who were saying what you have to do when you deal with South Africa is hang your conscience on a peg. You know, when you walk into South Africa, forget your conscience and just deal with it. So they knew it was wrong. But there was the Cold War, and there was uranium. And so you get, again, it's not this kind of flat, easy story, but there are all of these little eddies in there as they're trying to figure out how do we get to here when we find this to be absolutely odious, but we're fighting the Soviets over here. And one of the things that dealt with colonialism is, you know, is all of this is tying in, was the overarching piece of the Cold War and where the new nations, where those in Africa and where those in Asia, were they going to end up in the East or in the West? And so trying to find a way to make that happen that kept the Allies happy, that kept Africa and Asia out of the Soviet bloc. Yeah, I mean, so yeah. And I know that didn't answer your question, but in terms of straight, flat, smooth, easy, but this wasn't straight, flat, smooth, easy
Well, I just
policy.
wondered whether Tobias Channing caught one of the eddies.
Yeah, oh, he did.
Yeah.
The eddy that he caught was the one where they found that there was some of his handlers in the State Department found South Africa to be so repulsive that they were glad that somebody else basically shot their shot, right? That they couldn't say in public or do what he did. But the fact that you had somebody, you know, sort of like, oh, wow, you did that? Oh, man, wow. And again, you know, you can't quite see the smile